Welcome back. You're watching To The Point. A book published this week casts a new and revealing light on Jawaharlal Nehru, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Lord Mountbatten, the accession of Kashmir to India, and the way the border was drawn between India and Pakistan on the west. For many, its contents will be controversial, for some even possibly discomforting. The book is called Midnight's Furies, and its author, Nisid Hajari, is my guest today. Nisid Hajari, let's start with what you write about Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who for many Indians is a hate figure. You describe him as whiskey drinking and chain smoking. You say he eloped with a girl who was possibly 20 years younger than him. And then you write, they quickly became one of Bombay's most glamorous couples, cruising down Marine Drive in Jinnah's convertible at sunset each night, her hair loose in the wind. For a man who created Pakistan as a homeland for Indian Muslims, he seems to have been not just unreligious, but rather modern and cosmopolitan as well.
Very much so. He was one of the most modern Indian leaders at the time. He had more in common with Nehru, for instance, than either of them had with Gandhi. I mean, he was a secular figure. He was Muslim in the sense that he represented his community as a politician, but he didn't go to mosque. He wouldn't, have been quoting from the Quran in his speeches. He was a lawyer. He believed in fighting for rights, political rights for Muslims, not necessarily religious rights.
And he had no qualms about drinking whiskey or chain smoking, or the fact that he eloped with a girl 20 years younger who wasn't even Muslim.
Exactly. I was going to say, she was a Parsi girl. She was the daughter of a friend. She was 16 when they met. He was 40 years old at that time. And it was scandalous. I mean, it was her father at first tried to prevent the marriage, and it was, and she herself was a very daring woman, dressed very provocatively, very sort of quote-unquote fast for her time, but he didn't mind this at all.
And it's even said that he ate ham.
Yes, there is a story that she used to bring him ham sandwiches at his office in the courthouse. Again, he was a man who was Muslim by culture, not by religion. I mean, he drank whiskey until the very end.
Now, of the early Jinnah, you write, he believed that the British were deliberately stoking Muslim anxieties in order to justify the continuation of the Raj. He called the spectre of Hindu domination a bogey. That's one aspect of Jinnah that we in India today either don't know or have conveniently forgotten.
No, exactly. This period, this is sort of the 19-teens, 1920s, Jinnah was as much of a nationalist, if not more so, than any of the figures that we think of today as Indian nationalists, like Gandhi, like Nehru. His dispute with Gandhi was not over religion. It wasn't over Hindus versus Muslims. It was over this political strategies Gandhi was suggesting that they use in the freedom movement. Jinnah wanted to do things, through negotiation, in drawing rooms, one professional man to another. Gandhi wanted to take the movement to the streets.
In fact, he particularly disagreed with Gandhi over the Khilafat movement. When Gandhi was championing the cause of the Khilafat in Turkey, and Jinnah was completely against it. He felt the introduction of religion into politics was wrong.
Exactly. This was his big dispute with Gandhi. When Gandhi came back from South Africa, and he came back as a semi-mystical figure, and his appeal to the Indian masses was phrased in Hindu terms and Hindu iconography, because that was what he knew. That was his background. But it was something that Jinnah really worried about. That once you start inciting people using this kind of language, it's very easy for them to turn on one another afterwards.
In fact, you go one step further. You write, and I'm quoting you, Jinnah worried less about Hindus than about the danger of inflaming religious passion amongst Muslims. He had no sympathy for what you call rough-edged Muslims, nor for their fanatic cause. Religious fanaticism was something that he found either distasteful or perhaps even abhorrent.
No, very much so, and whether it came from Hindus or Muslims. And in fact, as you say, he was worried about the Khilafat movement because the leaders of the movement were these fiery, Oxford-educated brothers who were using, Islam as their rallying cry. This is something he mistrusted greatly, and it was something that he himself never really picked up until much later in his career.
That's what I was going to ask you. How then did this Jinnah, secular, modern, cosmopolitan, not religious, end up becoming a man who believed that there wasn't political space for Muslims in a united India? What made him believe that in fact Muslims would be squeezed out, that they needed a homeland?
Well, I think that the turning point came in the 1937 elections. Jinnah had, over the course of the 1920s, his political star had been declining. His wife, his young wife, left him at a certain point and then eventually committed suicide. And he left and went to England in exile. When he came back in 1936-37, he wanted to build up a Muslim constituency and then form a coalition with the Congress, which was led by Nehru at the time. Nehru rejected this idea outright, just said that if any Muslims wanted to be part of a coalition government in any state, province in India, they would have to join the Congress. They couldn't follow Jinnah.
You're saying something that's almost eye-opening for Indians, unless they've been following history closely, that Jinnah wanted to create a Muslim constituency as a way of becoming an ally of Congress, not in opposition to or in challenge to Congress. And the problem was, Nehru refused to accept him as an ally, thus pushing him out of the door.
Exactly. And at this point, remember, Jinnah has come back from exile. He's running these elections. His Muslim League has done very poorly in the elections, but Congress had done even worse among Muslims. The Muslim vote had gone to regional parties in the Punjab and Bengal and so forth. So he had nothing left. I mean, his political standing was nil at that point. And what he did was he took his own personal sort of feelings of disenfranchisement and tied them to those of Muslims, because now Muslims began to see what life would look like in a united India.
On this question of the relationship between Jinnah and Nehru and how Jinnah wished to be an ally of Congress, using Muslims as a support base to come closer to them, and how Nehru refused to accept him and almost pushed him out of the door, you have a very telling comment right at the end of the book. You say, Nehru, though suave, contributed very nearly as much to Jinnah as Jinnah did to the poisoning of the political atmosphere of the time. You add, Nehru's attitude towards Jinnah was all too often arrogant and dismissive rather than understanding. He didn't seem to understand that he needed to accommodate his countrymen rather than push him out of the door. Exactly. You blame Nehru almost as much as you blame Jinnah for partition.
As a politician, yes. It was the responsibility lay with the larger party, the more powerful party, the Congress, to make concessions, to include Muslims within their vision for India, and accept the leaders that Muslims chose for themselves. If that happened to be Jinnah, then it was Jinnah. Jinnah at that point was still somebody that Congress could have worked with, but they refused to do it.
Now, as you say in your book, Jinnah's political career took many twists and turns. He often changed the position that he had adopted a decade earlier. And you write that barely a year before independence, Jinnah essentially gave up the demand for Pakistan. A fact, you say, that's not stressed in Pakistani textbooks. What was it that happened in 46, literally just 12, 13 months before independence, that made him give up the demand? And then what happened over the next 12 months that made him change his mind all over again?
Well, see, he gave it up initially. The British were proposing a compromise whereby the Pakistan areas would have a certain degree of autonomy and power, and there would be a loose federal government in Delhi. This was the cabinet mission plan. So you would maintain a united India, but with sort of a semi-Pakistan within it. And he accepted it partly because it was a decent compromise, and also partly because the Cold War was just beginning at that time. And Jinnah was looking at how Pakistan could survive on its own. And a British general did a study for him showing that Pakistan could not defend itself against a Soviet invasion.
So if I can interrupt, it was a federal or almost a confederal India that he was happy to accept.
Exactly. And he did accept it. He did accept it.
What then made him change his mind in the next 12 months?
So then, after he accepted it, then they had to wait until Congress accepted it. And they went through several back and forth. Gandhi initially was opposed to it. Finally, they accepted it. Then Nehru, famously, in a press conference, was feeling pressure from his own left wing for having made these concessions, for not having a strong central government that could impose the socialist vision that he had for India. And he said something along the lines of, we're just making this deal now while the British are here, but once they're gone, we'll do whatever we want. We won't be bound by anything. And so, of course, Jinnah, hearing this, how can he possibly trust these supposed partners of his in this compromise?
So once again, in effect, it was Nehru slamming the door through a casual, thoughtless comment that made Jinnah change his mind. And this, in fact, has happened several times in Jinnah's history. It happened from 1937 onwards. Jinnah was willing to reach out, wanting to find a way of forming an alliance with the Congress. Nehru kept periodically shutting the door. Exactly.
I mean, Nehru was a very impetuous politician. I mean, after he made these comments in the press conference, Sardar Patel described them as verbal insanity. It was just a stupid thing to say. It was off the cuff. It was impassioned, and it was the sort of thing that Nehru would do over and over again.
So there's a very interesting conclusion we come to about Jinnah and Nehru before I move on to other subjects. Jinnah was a man who would have been happy with a confederal or a loosely federal India, but Nehru periodically slammed the door, and that's what you mean when you criticize Nehru for not being pragmatic, for not being generous.
Exactly.
Right? In other words, Jinnah was at least half pushed out of India.
Exactly. I mean, I think there were many moments where a political deal could have occurred, but Nehru refused to make the concessions necessary to.
This is why in your book you see Jinnah and Nehru both responsible for partition. The Indian view that Jinnah was the villain on his own is not accurate.
I would say that, yes. I mean, of course, if Jinnah had never taken up the Pakistan demand, then you wouldn't have had the whole issue of partition. You wouldn't have this problem. But even once he had been pushing this for years and years, there was still a moment when a compromise could have been reached.
Now, your book is also essentially about partition. It's about independence. And you write in some detail about how Sir Cyril Ratcliffe attempted to draw the border on the west between India and Pakistan. And at the time, the great question was, would Firozpur be given to India or would it be given to Pakistan? And in your book, you say Mountbatten pretty clearly appeared to have pressured Ratcliffe to redraw the map to give Firozpur to India. From India's point of view, how critical was that pressure and how critical was the decision that Firozpur became Indian?
I don't think it was definitive. I mean, it was certainly Mountbatten's pressure that changed it. But there's been all this talk and conspiracy theories about how this was done because there was an arms depot, a military base in Firozpur that would go to India. It was really more, if you look at the map, because if it had gone the other way, Amritsar would have been surrounded on three sides by Pakistan territory. And this was a way to sort of create a safer border.
Would it have affected India's access to Kashmir?
Firozpur, no. The part that would have was Gurdaspur in the north of the Punjab. And again, this is an area where Pakistanis believe that Mountbatten changed the border. He did not. The original draft of the border that Radcliffe had come up with is the same as the final one when it comes to Gurdaspur.
So the belief that the Pakistanis have that Mountbatten changed the border over Gurdaspur and thus affected their access to Kashmir is not true.
It's not
but
true.
What is true, according to you, is that Mountbatten put pressure and effectively, in quotations, gerrymandered Firozpur to make sure that became Indian.
Exactly, he did.
Was that because of the fact that Mountbatten and Edwina and Nehru had a very close, friendly relationship, and that in some way permitted Nehru to put a degree of pressure?
Well, Mountbatten certainly favored Nehru, but partly it was personal. Partly he got along better with Nehru. They were men of the same sort of class and upbringing. But partly also Mountbatten came to India wanting to preserve a united India. And so he was much more interested in having India as a strong ally of the British than Pakistan at that point.
So both his ideological inclinations as well as his personal friendship with Nehru bent in favor of India.
It did at that time.
Your book also focuses quite a great amount of time on the horrible communal massacres that happened at the time. You write about one that we in India today are not really that familiar with, the killing of Muslims in Jammu in November 1947 by Dogra soldiers. By your own estimate, something like 4,000 or 5,000 got killed, but others have put the figure at 20,000. Pakistanis have even said that it's perhaps crossed 100,000. What actually happened at the time?
It's very unclear. I mean, the records of this period are very scattershot. There were very few eyewitness accounts. There were stories about the Maharaja of Kashmir's soldiers going through and driving out or killing Muslims from Jammu. And there's at least one incident that clearly happened that Nehru himself acknowledges in his letters, where the Maharaja soldiers drove busloads of Muslims, telling them they were going to go to Pakistan, and then dumped them out and killed them in the forest. What the exact death toll is very unclear. I would doubt the 300,000 number, because those numbers were based on these sort of very rough calculations that there had been 300,000 people here before, and now there were none, and so they must have all been killed. In fact, most of them probably migrated.
You, in fact, in your book, I think, settled for a figure somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000, but that's bad enough.
It is.
Because it all happened at one go.
Well, the 4,000 or 5,000 is from this one attack. I think the overall number is something closer to 10,000 or 20,000.
Now, in fact, when you write about communal massacres at the time of partition, you also write about Nehru's incredible individual personal heroism. You write in your book that he would fearlessly take on entire crowds without any concern for his own safety. In fact, as you put it, Nehru angrily faced down mobs himself, rushing from trouble spot to trouble spot. At night, he drove around the city agitated and sleepless, once even picking up a terrified Muslim couple and bringing them to his own home for safety.
It's incredibly honorable. It's a beautiful image to see this man, risking his life to go out there to save Muslims in the city of Delhi, to preserve this idea of India that he had of Hindus and Muslims living together. At the same time, it was also ineffective, right? I mean, what can one man do against these huge mobs when he leads the country? There was a great incident where a friend came to him and told him about a certain trouble spot in Delhi where Muslims were being killed. Nehru's initial reaction was to grab a gun himself and go out there and try and prevent this, rather than calling the police, rather than directing the army to go there and solve the problem.
And he was, in fact, the only major Indian politician who was prepared to do this.
He was, well, there were, he had supporters, obviously, but, he himself had, since youth, had been a very, very active, impetuous figure. He pictured himself, on the front lines fighting for Indian independence. This was an extension of that. Others were more supportive morally.
Now, another element that you focus on in your book is the accession of Kashmir to India. Your book suggests that Indian soldiers arrived in Srinagar before the Maharaj had actually signed the document of accession. That's something that Pakistan has repeatedly claimed for the last 67 years, but India's vehemently denied it. How confident are you that you're correct?
I'm very confident about that, and I think it's fairly well accepted among academics at this point. There were 2 eyewitnesses who saw V.P. Menon, who was carrying the documents of accession for the Maharaja to sign, landing in Srinagar after Indian troops were already at the airfield. He had tried to go the day before. He had missed his flight. He had had drinks at that evening with a British diplomat who recorded this very clearly. And then the next morning he was on a flight with another British diplomat who said that he saw Menon get off in Jammu at X time. And when the plane landed in Srinagar, the troops were already there.
So you're absolutely convinced that, in fact, India was, in a sense, covering up because they were embarrassed by the technicality, although it doesn't actually affect anything.
Exactly right. I think it's just a technicality.
Let's come back to Jinnah and let's come back to Nehru. You have an incredible, some would say bizarre story about what is effectively Jinnah's last journey when he returned from Ziyarat in Baluchistan to Government House in Karachi. After the plane landed in Karachi and he was going by ambulance to Government House, the ambulance broke down. And for a whole hour he was left in a sweltering ambulance without much protection, with a nurse to actually swat the flies, and a couple of hours later he then died.
Right. It's an ignoble end for the man who had founded this country. He had been very sick for a few months at that point, and he'd been trying to keep it very secret. He didn't even want to let his deputy, Liaquat Ali Khan, know how deathly ill he was. So when he flew back to Karachi, he didn't tell anyone that he was there. None of the officials knew. An ambulance met him.
It was literally a secret trip back.
It was a secret trip back. I mean, obviously some people knew, but the main figures of the government did not. So when the ambulance broke down, they had to call and they had to wait for another one to drive out from town to come get him. And ironically, it was broken down in front of a refugee camp with refugees from the Punjab who had been victims of the massacre.
That's almost ironic symbolism. But the sad, incredible truth is that the head of state, the Governor General of Pakistan, the man who created the country, was stranded in a broken down ambulance for a whole hour on a hot, sweltering summer afternoon with a nurse to swat the flies, and absolutely no one else there to help him.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. It shows just how isolated he was, and also how chaotic things were at that time. I mean, this was only 1 year after independence, and the Pakistani government was still a little shaky. It wasn't fully established. There were the processes weren't in place to have handled something like this.
Now, you also write about Nehru's love life. It's something that fascinates Indians. Clearly, the Gandhi family doesn't talk very much about it. But you refer to Padmaja Naidu as Nehru's one-time lover. How confident are you of that?
I think it's fairly obvious. If you look at his letters, which are in his published, collected works, which are very public, there's a whole series of letters in 1936, 37, around the time that Jinnah comes back, which are essentially love letters, and they're very beautiful. Some of them, and he was very passionate in them. And then you also there's anecdotes from other people around him, memoirs, where they talk about them sort of living together in the same house and the feelings they had for one another and so
living together in the same house.
Well, temporarily. I mean, it wasn't just the two of them in the house. It was sort of there were quite a few people living in the house. She happened to be there at the
What
time.
about Edwina Mountbatten? That is the lady around whom many of the stories about Nehru's romances are spun. Were they just platonic, or were they lovers as well, as many believe?
Well, I think in the period that I look at in the book, there's no evidence they were anything more than platonic. The evidence that people cite to show
at that particular period is the year before independence, up to the year after.
Yeah, 46 to 48. I think if there is any evidence showing that it became more than platonic, it would have been after Edwina left India in 1948. And then she would come back periodically. And what happened then, I'm not, I wouldn't venture to say. I don't have enough proof.
Her daughter records that when Edwina died, suitcases were found with Nehru's letters, and separately Nehru's niece, Nayanthara Sehgal, has said that her mother, Vijayalakshmi Pandit, had always believed that it would be terribly sad if the relationship was actually platonic.
Well, that's entirely true. I mean, or entirely possible. They certainly had a connection. They developed a connection during this period, during the riots, because they were both, the type of people to jump in immediately. Edwina helped with refugees. She was helping out with hospitals. Nehru greatly admired this. She greatly admired him for his forthrightness in his action. He was much more a man of action than even her husband was.
In a sense, I've asked you this question again earlier, but I want to repeat it. Did the relationship with Edwina, the friendship with Mountbatten, work to India's advantage?
I think the relationship with Mountbatten did. I wouldn't say the relationship with Edwina did. I think Mountbatten and Nehru instantly took a liking to one another. And on top of that, though, I mean, as I said, Mountbatten's mission was to preserve a united India. So, of course, he favored the man who also wanted
But you know that
India.
Pamela Hicks, Mountbatten's daughter, has actually recorded in the book she wrote 6-7 years ago that Mountbatten would often use the influence Edwina had on Nehru to try and change Nehru's mind on particular issues.
Well, there were elements of that, but I don't know that it would have worked to India's advantage. Most of those things were things that Mountbatten was doing for Britain's advantage.
What about the decision to take the Kashmir issue to the United Nations? Was that one area where Mountbatten's influence, either directly or through Edwina, could have told?
Definitely, I mean, Mountbatten put great pressure on Nehru at that time, understandably so, because he feared an outright war between India and Pakistan that would be damaging to India as to Pakistan. This was a legitimate concern. And yes, he did put great pressure on Nehru. Nehru respected him. That played a role in his decision. I don't know if that it was definitive, though.
Let's come to the conclusions you draw, and although I call them conclusions, you don't draw them in such a definitive sense, but you certainly tentatively suggest them. First, you say of Jinnah, there is little question that Jinnah was the most polarizing figure in the partition drama. He is easy to blame, his forbidding personality made compromise difficult if not impossible, and he was criminally negligent about thinking through the consequences of the demand for partition, and particularly Pakistan. That's a pretty damning verdict.
I think it's fair, though. Jinnah, there's often this debate about whether Jinnah ever intended to have an independent Pakistan or whether this was a bargaining chip. I believe it began as a bargaining chip and evolved into something else, but it evolved in a way that Jinnah allowed to happen without thinking through the practical implications of it. How would this government work? How would you connect East Pakistan to West Pakistan? How would you unite these different regions that had very little in common with each other other than Islam? And how would you do that without making your state a theocracy? He never answered these questions even for himself.
You know what you're suggesting? You're suggesting that it wasn't Pakistan as an idea of a separate state that he was so committed to, as Pakistan as a tool for projecting his leadership and giving him a prominence which otherwise he might not have had. Was he using Pakistan rather than seeking to create a homeland for Muslims, which of course he did in the end?
I think he was using Pakistan, but he was using Pakistan to create a better deal for Muslims within a united India.
And he didn't realize that he would end up outside India.
Exactly. I mean, I think at the end he did. I mean, at a certain point after 1946, he felt that he couldn't get it anywhere unless he had an independent state.
Now, of Pakistan, you quote the American journalist Philip Stolbert, who said, "Hatred of India is the cement that holds Pakistan together." Do you yourself share that view?
I believe it was true when Talbot wrote that in 1950, and I believe there are elements of truth to it now. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. I don't think it's inherent to Pakistan. I think this is has been created over the decades by various military rulers, by the Pakistani army. They've created this system whereby the army is the defender of the nation. Islam is the thing that unifies the nation. The army is the defender of Islam. This breeds loyalty among the population. It unifies the state. That doesn't have to be the way it is, but it is the way it's developed.
You've studied Jinnah, you've understood him, you've, in a sense, written about him from his early days when he was modern, unreligious, secular, cosmopolitan, through to the man who eventually became the father of Pakistan because he was using the concept and then became committed to the concept. What would he make of Pakistan today and the way it's developed?
I don't think he would recognize it. This wasn't the nation that he intended. I mean, I think he was sincere when he said that he did not want any movement of population at partition. He thought all the Hindus and Sikhs who lived in Pakistan would stay there, and they would be a very large minority. Muslims would be the majority, but just barely so, and enough to sort of ensure that their interests would be taken care of. But he envisioned, it's a famous quote, he envisioned India and Pakistan living like the US and Canada, two nations very similar to one another, living side by side with trade relations and people-to-people exchanges and everything.
Was he equally sincere in that famous speech, I think it's August the 11th, 1947, where he said, you can be Hindu, you can be Christian, you can be Muslim, that's your personal faith and choice. Your religion has nothing to do with the state. It's a particular speech that today the Pakistanis almost disown, right? But was he sincere when he made it?
I think he was very sincere because he had said the same sorts of things repeatedly. It's often portrayed, this speech, as a singular event that was sort of a surprise. But if you go back and look at his interviews and public statements he made, just a month or two before, he had told an interviewer who had asked whether Pakistan would be a theocracy, he said, to get that idea out of your head, that's ridiculous. That is not what Pakistan will be.
So he would not be happy with the way Pakistan has turned out?
I don't think he would. I mean, a Pakistan where Muslims are killing other Muslims, where the army is dominant rather than civilian leadership, I don't think that's the Pakistan.
That is not the Pakistan of his dreams.
I don't think so, no.
Finally, you say Pakistan's misfortune was that after Jinnah it was ruled by a succession of weak and uninspiring politicians with little connection to their adopted homeland. Whilst India's fortune was that Nehru's long stint in office blessed India with continuity and stability. Are you sort of suggesting, as I think you are, that good luck and bad luck have played a critical role in the way the two countries have fared?
To a degree. I mean, Pakistan was started from a much poorer position. I mean, it had a huge army and very little of an economy. So there were ways in which the deck was stacked against them. But imagine if Jinnah had lived 20 more years the way that Nehru did. Might he have been able to create the Pakistan that he envisioned? Might he have been able to force this through against opposition within Pakistan? Possibly. I mean, I won't say for sure that he could have, because I don't think even he realized how difficult it would be once he started. But Pakistan would have had a better chance if he had lived.
Something that is suggested by that answer is that the right sort of leader, living for long enough and having the influence that he did, can make a big difference in either creating and establishing a new country, and his absence can make a huge difference in ensuring that country never gets established properly. Nehru and India's good fortune was Nehru was the strong leader who lived 20 years. Pakistan's misfortune was that Jinnah could have been that leader, but didn't last more than 15 months.
No, exactly right. I mean, imagine if the positions had been reversed, if Nehru had died 1 year after independence. Nehru and Gandhi had already been assassinated, remember. Nehru and Gandhi were the ones fighting hardest to maintain India as a secular nation, as a multi-faith nation. If there were that wasn't a very popular position at that time. It's entirely possible you could have had a Hindu nationalist prime minister who would have turned out Muslims, who would have changed the character of India if Nehru had not been there.
It's a thought that many in today's government, perhaps in India, might not agree with. But what you're saying is that if Nehru had died in 15 months as Jinnah died, India could have ended up a lot more like Pakistan than it is today.
It's possible. And on the other hand, again, as I said before, India started from a much stronger position. It had a government in place. It was much more stable. It had a much more powerful economy. It definitely had more going for it.
Sure, but throw the dice the other way, and the fortune could have been reversed.
Exactly.
Nisid Hajari, a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much.